Hey there, it's Wednesday, which means it's time for another Ask Me Anything session with your friendly neighborhood book editor. We have some great questions on deck today, but let me get the obligatory stuff out of the way first. If you haven't already, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, and also download my free story self-assessment in the description below. It's a worksheet that's going to help you identify the strengths and weaknesses in your own story, and it's going to sign you up for my exclusive newsletter that is launching soon. Without further ado, let's dive right in. First question here. I have been done with my book for a while now, but I keep nitpicking at things I'm scared the literary agent won't like. I've gotten feedback from people that say my book is really good, and I think so too. However, my question is, how do you know when to stop revising your book so you don't accidentally ruin the good scenes? Also, how can you tell when your book is absolutely complete? This is a really, really good question, because at the end of the day, you can always keep revising, you can always keep editing, and at some point you have to take your hands off and just stop messing with the manuscript, right? But it is so hard to determine what that moment is. And in fact, many writers will even go through the entire publication process and see their book tangibly printed and still want to mess with it or wish that they changed an element of the story. So at some point, you really need to just decide for yourself that the story is as strong as it is going to be. Now, it sounds like you are in the position of trying to determine when it is basically ready for querying, which is admittedly very difficult to determine. However, you took a really, really good step in that you got feedback from others, and it sounds like they had very positive feedback. If you've incorporated all of the constructive critiques that they've given and you've taken them to heart, and they ultimately think the book is in a really good place, and critically, you also said you feel like it's in a really good place, then I would say you are at the right point to query literary agents and see how it goes. If you query literary agents and you are getting only rejections, or ideally they are offering you some kind of feedback in those rejections, then I might take a step back and listen to what the agents are saying and see if potentially you can tweak your query materials and or the manuscript itself in order to address some of those issues that they might be calling out. But if you're at the point where you're looking at your manuscript and you're saying, this is as good as I can make it, I don't really see much more I could do substantially to change it, then this is a good point for you to send it out to those literary agents. Also remember that if what you're doing is just tweaking a few lines of dialogue and it's not substantial changes to the overarching story, then it's not really going to make a difference one way or another in terms of if the agent is going to offer you representation or not. If you're just nitpicking, which it sounds like you are, then it's likely time for you to send it out and see how it goes. I wish you the best. Here's the next question. How do you think we should address an agent in the query email? Hi Jane, dear, and what would you put in the subject line? The email subject line and the salutation line often cause a lot of confusion and anxiety, so I'm glad that you asked this. Let's start with the subject line. For this, I would follow whatever the literary agent specifies. Usually they say what you should put in there. Sometimes they ask you to put your name. Sometimes they ask you to put the title of the book. Sometimes they ask you to put the agent's name if you are querying a general submissions inbox for the entire agency. Make sure you double check what they say. If they don't say anything, then I would use something like query dash the name of the project. As for the salutation, in my experience, the agents I worked with were always open to being addressed by first name. So hi Elizabeth was a perfectly fine way to begin the query, or dear Elizabeth if you want to be a little bit more formal. Some people prefer to do Mr., Mrs. titles. If that's what you feel more comfortable with, go right ahead. I would just be really careful with the female titles, Miss versus Mrs., to make sure that you're not making any assumptions as to the marital status of the agent. Also, make sure you're not making any assumptions on pronouns, so you'll want to double check that they list their pronouns there. Again, first name in most cases I think is completely fine. Next question here. How do you go about querying when you want to publish under a pseudonym? Do you use your government name when submitting or use the pen name in the letter? And how feasible is it to publish anonymously in traditional publishing? First question about how you query. You will use your government name here. The agent ultimately is going to need to know who you are for professional reasons. You are entering a business agreement with them, so you definitely want to use your government name, sign off with your government name, and give a little bio about who you are as a person. You can mention in the query letter that you plan to publish under a pen name, or that you have an established pseudonym that you have published under previously. I will say that over the course of my years working in the industry, I only worked with 1 or 2 authors who published under a pseudonym. And they actually originally published under their given government name. They switched to a pseudonym because they were switching genres, or they were kind of trying to rebrand themselves as a writer. So you'll see that track more common in traditional publishing, I feel, than someone publishing under a pseudonym from the start. It's not unheard of at all, but I would say it is more common in traditional publishing to use your given name. This is something that I would recommend just speaking with your literary agent about. If they have any concerns about you using a pen name versus your government name, they will definitely be able to advise you. I don't think that it is going to affect your success in querying, whether you use a pen name or are going to publish under your government name. The agent is likely just going to note that, but it's not going to be the deciding factor in whether or not they want to work with you. Another question here. How many copies does your traditionally published debut novel need to sell before your publisher will consider your next book? How many months does it usually take before the publisher gives a verdict on how well the book has sold? Great, but tricky question here. The amount of copies that a traditional publisher expects to sell for a debut author depends on so many things, so I cannot give you a specific range. Largely, it depends on your genre. And it also depends on what they have determined are your specific comp titles within the genre. Backtrack a little bit here. When a publisher offers a book deal to an author, they have calculated an advance that they are willing to pay that author for the rights to publish their book. How they calculate that advance number is through a profit and loss statement that uses the sales of the comp titles to determine how much money those books made, and therefore how much money they expect your book to make. So they are most likely going to be tracking your sales on your comps, which are going to be tailored specifically to your book and your genre. So say if your comp titles both sold 2,000 copies within the first month of being published and yours sold 100, then maybe the publisher is going to be concerned about that and less likely to want to take on your next book. But I would say, even if that happens, the door is not shut necessarily. There are plenty of cases where an author's book did not sell as many copies as the publisher expected or intended, and yet they do continue to work with that author because they believe in their work. Many authors who traditionally publish 1 or 2 books at first, and they don't have their breakout book until their 3rd, 4th, 5th novel that gets traditionally published. There are so many examples of that happening, and publishers know that. There's no secret sauce for knowing what books are going to take off and what aren't. So if the publisher and your editor believes in you and your writing skill, even if your book sales are considered low, then they are likely still going to want to invest and work with you. Yes, that might mean that your next book deal is lower than your first one, but it doesn't mean that they're going to drop you entirely. As for how many months it takes a publisher to determine the book sales, they really do track book sales week by week and month by month. Editors and the publisher and editorial director of the imprint that you are published at are going to keep track of those sales. They're likely not going to necessarily involve you if they feel like the sales are low the first week or the first couple months. They're going to let it simmer for a while. And then most likely the conversation about the sales is going to come up several months later, or at the point where your literary agent is seeking to make a deal for your next book. I hope you found today's Q&A session interesting. If you haven't already, make sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and grab my free story self-assessment. Leave any other questions you have in the comments here. These videos are what I use as my cue when I'm going through, and keep them coming, and I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching, and happy writing.